Alright, so recently I posted my review of the M1 Max 16-inch MacBook Pro, and yeah, this thing is damn quick. It can handle my 6K video footage no problem at all, 60 megapixel RAW photos in Lightroom also no problem, all while basically sipping power and making no noise. So with this insane performance, I am just personally really curious to see, what the performance compares like versus my desktop PC setup, which is honestly kind of insane. It's one of the fastest PCs that you can build at the moment, and the comparison here, I'm just wondering how much performance I would be sacrificing if I was to take some of that video editing, photo editing workflow and go portable, because with my 2020 MacBook Pro, yeah, I could do that. I definitely could edit on the go, but by doing that, I was probably making the editing process about twice as long. At the very least, this video should give us an idea of how the fastest PC that you can build today compares to Apple's fastest current silicon, which is the M1 Max. So here's the PC that I've been using for the past year. All up, we're looking at about $6,000 crammed into a sub 13-liter mini ITX case, and it's fully piped with the best water cooling components on the market. It's packing some of the fastest components that you can build with right now, apart from the CPU, which was recently dethroned by Intel's 12900K. Still though, with a Ryzen 5950X and an RTX 3090 in there at the moment, this build just tears through absolutely everything I can throw at it. I use it for all of the video production stuff here on the channel, and it also doubles as my streaming and gaming PC as well. At the same time, this thing needs a ton of cooling to stay happy, and despite it being compact and somewhat portable, it's not like I'm going to lug this thing around with me to do some editing on the go. And I've actually been asked about this quite a lot, and that's the whole portability aspect of these compact computers that I'm typically building here on the channel. For me, the tiny form factor doesn't really have anything to do with portability at all, and it's almost entirely just about not building a PC bigger than it needs to be. Now, sure, you could chuck this thing in a very large backpack and take it around with you, but then you also need a monitor, a keyboard, a mouse, and most importantly, a power outlet. Even when I've gone to Computex, where I'm editing and publishing a couple of videos per day at least, I've always just brought a laptop and then just compromised on the footage itself. Usually that means filming and editing in 1080p rather than 4K or 6K. Whenever I've gone on holidays as well, I typically like to bring a little bit of work with me there too, and again, it's always a laptop, not a mini ITX PC with a ton of stuff around it. With the new M1 Max though, that's not really a compromise that I need to make anymore. As my initial review showed, I can edit 6K video on this thing no problem at all, and at the same time, things like timeline scrubbing, image stabilization, color grading, even exporting, speed-wise, it at least feels exactly the same to my desktop PC. And while we're on the note of video editing, let's talk about that first, because the results here are honestly quite insane. So I'm currently shooting on the Sony a7S III, which is a 4K mirrorless camera, but I'm also using the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera 6K when it comes to B-roll and stuff like that, and just having that raw footage to dial everything in just the way I want it. But whether I'm using the 6K footage or the 4K footage from the Sony, it just honestly feels exactly the same on either device, whether it's the new M1 Max 16-inch from Apple or my 3090 PC. Chopping up, editing the footage, color grading, all of that stuff, user experience wise, speed wise, I'm not being slowed down by either device, which is really good to see. What's really interesting though is when we take a look at the export times for the 15-minute 6K demo project that I've created here. And what's really interesting is the new 16-inch M1 Max, it's actually faster. In fact, almost twice as fast when we're exporting this in 6K resolution. This was a bit hard for me to believe at first, so I kept repeating and repeating the same benchmark over and over again and double checking all of the settings, and I kept getting the exact same result. For whatever reason, Apple's M1 Max 16-inch at least, the metal integration with Resolve Studio, that seems to be working incredibly well. When we export in 4K resolution instead of 6K, which is what I usually do anyway when I'm publishing here to YouTube, the results do get a lot closer. Still though, the M1 Max is faster than my $6,000 plus PC, and that should just not be happening. When we take a look at image stabilization, that's where the PC has a bit of an edge. This is mostly a GPU and GPU memory intensive workload, so we would expect the RTX 3090 to get the job done a fair bit quicker. In the end, it's about 27% faster. Next up, I wanted to quickly test how either device would handle 8K red raw footage, which, I don't personally use in my workflow, but hey, maybe in the future. But at the very least, I'm just trying to find the limits of this new Apple MacBook Pro. Here we can scrub fine with the RTX 3090 PC, color grade no problem. And surprisingly, so can the new M1 Max. And honestly, in terms of like timeline scrubbing, playing back the footage, that was identical on both the PC and the new MacBook, even with a fresh render cache. So, completely nuking the render cache, so that's not done at all. There was no problem just dropping the footage on the timeline, starting to color grade it, and, chop it up just as you would with a normal edit. So yeah, if you do this sort of stuff for a living, very heavy, high resolution raw video editing, then the 16-inch M1 Max could easily become your single do-it-all video editing machine, which is pretty cool. Next up, I want to talk about 3D modeling and rendering in Blender, which is not a very frequent workload for me, not something that I do a whole lot of, but hey, when the project calls for it, it is quite an intensive and time-consuming task, so I do want the fastest machine that I can get. I definitely don't want to be held up rendering when I could be doing other work and being productive. So with an RTX 3090 here and a 5950X, this is basically as good as it gets. Viewport rendering is, almost instant. You can make changes to your models, changes to your scenes really, really quickly. Unfortunately, that is not the same experience on the M1 Max because Blender does not support the GPU on M1 chips, at least for now. Hopefully we do get support soon for Apple's Metal API because I'm really looking forward to seeing what the GPU on the Apple M1 Max can do in Blender, but for now we are stuck with CPU rendering only. The 16-inch M1 Max is still surprisingly usable though, especially considering it's just the CPU that we're using here. The huge difference though really comes when we look at the render times. The Apple M1 Max chip took a little under 6 minutes, whereas the PC can do it in 25 seconds. So yeah, a pretty insane difference, and one which, even when Metal does get supported here in Blender, I'm not sure that would be enough to catch the current power of a full desktop RTX 3000 GPU. So when it comes to Blender projects, especially for those that use animations, I will 100% be sticking to PC. The MacBook Pro is still totally usable for the modeling aspect and, texturing aspect and stuff like that, but rendering performance is yet to show its full potential here. And lastly, we'll take a look at photo editing in Adobe Lightroom. Here we're looking at a handful of 61 megapixel raw photos shot on the Sony a7R IV. And before we take a look at the export times, I'll just say that actually applying adjustments, copying those changes to each image, and the actual editing process, all of that feels identical between the MacBook Pro and the PC. This is not a super multi-threaded or GPU intensive program. In fact, it seems to mostly scale well with how good the single-threaded performance is of whatever CPU you're using on your machine. That's pretty much confirmed here when we do take a look at the export times, where the result is pretty much the same between the two. I would actually say that if photo editing is all you're interested in doing, maybe the most demanding thing you do with your device, save your money and go with a much cheaper M1 laptop. Performance will be likely very, very similar. And we'll just finish up here with a look at a couple more benchmarks. Cinebench, while rendering on the CPU only, shows that the 5950X is about twice as fast as the 16-inch M1 Max, but that's while having over 3 times the amount of processing threads and pulling about 4 to 5 times as much power. So with that in mind, I think we can agree the performance here for the M1 Max is pretty respectable at least. Single-threaded performance in Cinebench is also quite interesting, with the Ryzen 5950X only taking a 6% lead. V-Ray 5 goes absolutely crazy on AMD Ryzen though for whatever reason, about 2.5 times faster here versus the Apple M1 Max. Again though, context matters. If Apple built a 16-core 32-thread CPU which runs at 140 watts plus, we'd be looking at some very different results here. But again, totally respectable performance here when looking at the raw CPU rendering performance. So in particular, heavy video editing with raw footage, high-res footage, 6K plus, that seems to be what the M1 Max is doing so well here. In comparison to my $6,000 plus PC, I was really, really surprised with the results, and also that the editing and color grading experience was pretty much identical between the two. So if that's what you're interested in, and you also need the mobility of a laptop, perhaps you're working from home and the office, and you need a single machine for both ideally, then I honestly don't think there is a better tool than the M1 Max. And this also gets me really excited for the future of Apple M1 desktop products. We are seeing this slow evolution and scaling up of the Apple M1 silicon, and I would love to see what Apple could do in terms of performance when not restricted to a laptop form factor. Of course, I still will be using my desktop PC. I think that's pretty clear, especially when it comes to gaming and streaming. That's probably the area where Apple has the most catching up to do to PC and just other Windows devices in general. For me, I'll say that both devices have a place in my own workflow, and it's just really nice to be able to take that heavy video editing and drop it on the laptop and go portable whenever I really want or need to, and have that as an option now and just have that full performance on tap. Hopefully these results were interesting or helpful to you in some way. As always, a huge thanks for watching, and I'll see you all in the next one.